All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome back. And we are still in Chapter 17 talking about some disorders. So we're going to be talking about anxiety disorder. So I kind of mentioned before that we'll be chatting about a few different things. So let's start off with anxiety. So what is anxiety? Well, anxiety is nervousness or agitation that we sometimes experience. Anxiety is a very important and very useful human emotion. It helps us stay safe, helps us get things done. It helps protect us from bad things out there, but too much anxiety can be debilitating and result in an anxiety disorder. So anxiety is too much when it keeps us from doing what we want to do and or what we need to do. So that's really how I explain it for people when they ask me, well, how do I know if my anxiety is getting, the best of me? Well, I say, well, if it's keeping you from doing what you have to do or what you want to do. So that's kind of a helpful frame, I guess. Now, anxiety disorders are amongst the most common disorders. So about 11.6% of Canadians aged 18% have reported either an anxiety or mood disorder in 2013. Now, interestingly, there is a high comorbidity between anxiety and mood disorders. Anxiety disorders are also highly comorbid with each other. In fact, it's more the rule rather than the exception that if you have one anxiety disorder, you likely will meet the criteria for a second one as well. So about 82% of children under the age of 13 and about 71% of adolescents 13 or over had a comorbid anxiety disorder. Now, for children, the prevalence of anxiety disorders are as such. So separation anxiety, obviously, for kids would be the highest, followed by generalized anxiety, social anxiety, and OCD. Now, there are strong genetic links for anxiety, and it looks like in many cases that it tends to run in families. And we also know that a child's temperament as a baby, in particular if they have a highly reactive temperament, they are more likely to develop an anxiety disorder or be diagnosed with an anxiety disorder later on in life. Now, an anxiety disorder is simply a normal fear response that's out of proportion to the actual threat that's experienced. So most people who experience this type of anxiety understand that their fear is irrational, but they really have a difficult time controlling their response. So this irrational fear often then leads to avoidance of situations or objects that interrupt a person's life in a significant way. One of the best examples that has kind of helped me to better understand anxiety disorder is Aureen Pinto Wagner's vicious cycle of avoidance, where she kind of basically shows the fact that for most of us, when we are experiencing an anxiety, we will initially kind of feel our anxiety climbing. So for example, if we're asked to do a public presentation, we come to the top here, we make a decision to go through with it, and as we go through it eventually our anxiety decreases and we kind of learn how to manage it. However, what ends up happening for someone with an anxiety disorder is the trigger comes, but they make the decision to avoid it. And the moment they avoid it, their anxiety drops quickly, but the problem is it keeps them from habituating to that anxiety and then leaves them stuck in this loop where the trigger returns and the only way they know how to respond is by avoiding it. Now, there are many different types of anxiety disorders. We will only touch on a few, probably some of the big ones, I guess, but the most common one is, or I guess the best known one, is generalized anxiety disorder. And that is a psychological disorder that's diagnosed in situations in which a person excessively worries about pretty much everything. Whether it's money, health, work, school, family life, relationships, a lot of things about the future. And what ends up happening is that there's a lot of avoidance then for things like risky or new situations, doing things without first seeking out reassurance, making sure it's going to be okay, a strong avoidance of making mistakes or breaking rules. Some of the other criteria that we often expect or that we kind of use for diagnosing it is that it's been occurring for at least 6 months, and again that it causes significant distress and dysfunction. About 3% of the general population suffer from GAD, and 2/3 of those are women. Another type of anxiety disorder is panic disorder, and this is a disorder that develops due to having had multiple prior panic attacks. And what ends up happening is that you have these panic attacks, and then you begin to develop a disorder where you begin to fear having another panic attack, which in turn leads you then to have more panic attacks. So the symptoms of a panic attack can be quite varied, but often it includes shortness of breath, heart palpitations, trembling, dizziness, choking sensations, nausea, and kind of an intense feeling of dread or impending doom. Now, panic attacks may last as little as 1 or as much as 20 minutes, but often they peak and they subside within about 10 minutes time. And so that's a long time to feel like you're going to die, or that you feel that you are in deep trouble. So we call a panic disorder a disorder when it's characterized by sudden attacks of anxiety and terror that have led to significant behavioral changes in a person's life. Sufferers are often anxious because they fear that they're going to have another panic attack, and so the avoidance behavior are situations where they've had a panic attack or where it might likely occur. So, for example, avoiding the shopping mall, a classroom, or crowds, if those have been places where they've either had a panic attack or where they're worried they might have one. They will also tend to avoid activities that may cause similar symptoms, so things like exercise. So, all right, so we've talked about GAD, we've talked about panic attacks, we're going to talk about phobias. So phobias are a specific fear of a certain object, situation, or activity. And phobias are one of the most common groups of anxiety disorders. And the fear experience can range anywhere from feeling uneasy to straight up panic. And phobias are characterized by their specificity and their irrationality. So they're very specific, and the person generally knows that they're irrational, but the fear gets the best of them. There's another phobia. We used to call it social phobia. We have now since called it social anxiety disorder. But this is another anxiety disorder which there is an extreme shyness around people or a discomfort in social situations. And this is due to a fear of being negatively evaluated by others. So people with social phobia have a fear of being laughed at, looking silly, being embarrassed, or having others think negatively of them. So the avoidance behaviors that we tend to see are social situations. So they will avoid social situations at school, being with other people, looking different, speaking or performing in front of others. Additionally, there is another kind of gender-based difference in that women are somewhat more likely to suffer from social anxiety disorder than men. Another anxiety disorder is called agoraphobia, and it's a very particular type of phobia. And this is an anxiety about being in places or situations from which escape might be difficult or embarrassing, or in which help may not be available. So the avoidance behaviors are avoiding things, very specific things, so avoiding things like public transportation, open or closed spaces, crowds, or being away from home. Oftentimes, people with agoraphobia really have a great difficulty with leaving their homes and interacting with other people. And they often are dependent on a companion in order to be functional in public. So they won't leave the home unless someone goes with them. And not just anybody, but a specific person who's aware of their needs and will bail them out when they begin to feel that they are in distress. Now, obsessive-compulsive disorders, or OCD, is no longer considered an anxiety disorder as per the DSM, and yet the roots of OCD is strongly driven by anxiety. So, we're going to talk about it because it used to be, up until 2013, in the anxiety chapter, and now it's moved into its own chapter, but really it is driven as well by anxiety, though it looks a little bit different. So OCD is a psychological disorder that's diagnosed when an individual experiences distressing or frightening thoughts and engages in obsessions, which are repetitive or intrusive thoughts, and compulsions, which are repetitive behaviors to calm these thoughts. Okay, so you've got the anxiety, something comes into your mind, it's distressing and it causes you anxiety, but then in order to get rid of that anxiety, you have to do something about it. So that's the compulsion. Okay, so the compulsion is how you deal with the obsession. So OCD is diagnosed when the obsessive thoughts and compulsive behaviors cause distress and significant dysfunction. So what are obsessions? Well, obsessions can be anything from worrying about germs, getting sick or dying, having extreme fears about bad things happening or about doing something wrong, having a feeling that things have to be just right, having disturbing and unwanted thoughts or images about hurting others, and or having disturbing and unwanted thoughts or images of a sexual nature. Now, please hear me. we have so many memes and so many people say, oh, it's just my OCD because I like things really straight and neat and tidy and ordered. No, that's not OCD. That's you liking things very straight, neat, tidy, and ordered. OCD is a significantly impairing mental health disorder. And so I want you, and I hope that you hear in my voice just how important it is for us to understand that for OCD, it is a debilitating disorder that keeps many people unable to function well in their life. In fact, it's in the top 10 most debilitating disorders out there. So I want you to hear me when I say that it's not just liking things just neat and tidy. It is very, very debilitating. And some of the most debilitating presentations are when a person has these thoughts, these unwanted and disturbing thoughts about hurting themselves or hurting someone else. And that keeps them from doing other things. So those are the obsessions. Now, what are the compulsions? So the compulsions are the things you have to do then to deal with these obsessions, okay? So for example, if you've got a worry about someone breaking into your house, what you'll do then is you'll engage in excessive checking, so rechecking that the door is locked, that the oven is off, all of those things. If you've got a fear of germs, you're going to do excessive washing and or cleaning, so you're washing your hands more than you have to, you're running them under scalding hot water instead of just under normal water, you're washing them for 20 minutes at a time. It's a very excessive response. So if you've got a concern about things needing to be just right, so you often repeat actions until they're just right, starting things over again, counting until something is right, ordering or arranging things in a very particular way, and then reordering and rearranging them. Having mental compulsions, so excessive praying or mental reviewing, frequent confessing or apologizing, needing to say lucky words or numbers to keep the bad thing from happening, doing some of that excessive reassurance seeking, so are you sure I'm going to be okay? Am I going to make it? All right, needing to, if you've got a fear about getting sick, needing to go to the hospital and not just being checked out by a doctor and said it's okay, like needing medical tests to prove that you're going to be okay. Right, so these are very extreme responses to that fear. And unless that compulsion is fulfilled, it leads to significant distress for the person with that obsession. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is that not only do you have these obsessions and compulsions, you also have avoidance behavior. So the anxiety, so what you're avoiding is anything, is that you're avoiding that anxiety that's caused by the obsessive thought or that precedes a compulsive behavior, or in some cases, if the thought that you have, the obsession that you have is so distressing, so for example, a thought you might hurt someone else, you actually then begin to avoid public places for fear that you might accidentally hurt someone, even though that may not actually ever be part of your history or your life experience. Now, OCD can occur anytime between preschool age all the way to adulthood. The most common age range for onset is somewhere between ages 8 to 12, and the second most common age range is in the late teens and early adulthood. Now, if you are interested in talking more about OCD, this is a particular area of interest for me. And so, if you got questions about OCD, give me get in touch. Love to chat with you about it. Now, we've talked about PTSD in our previous chapter on stress, so I'm not going to take a whole bunch of time on it right now. But PTSD is a very debilitating disorder as well that can result after adverse events, including combat, assault, natural disasters. So people with PTSD experience high levels of anxiety, along with re-experiencing the trauma through those flashbacks, and a strong desire to avoid any reminders of the event. And so the reason why it's included here, as well as OCD, is just to demonstrate that this anxiety, again, this is that cross-cutting piece of disorders, right, of diagnosis as well, is that many disorders have some of these common features with each other. And so for PTSD, there is also this anxious component, this anxious avoidance of triggers that have led to the distress. All right, I'm not going to make you do that right now, but there are some important things. So how do we explain anxiety disorders? Well, we know that both nature and nurture contribute to the development of anxiety disorders. So humans have evolved to fear dangerous situations. That is a plus. And so because of that, though, we know that there is this genetic component. We also know that anxiety disorders, including PTSD, are heritable. They are transmittable. However, Whether genetic predisposition to anxiety becomes expressed as a disorder really depends on a lot of environmental factors. So, for example, people who were abused in childhood are more likely to be anxious than those who had fairly normal childhoods. We also know that anxieties can be learned through classical and operant conditioning. Classical conditioning may also be accompanied by stimulus generalization. So what that is saying is that if a stimulus becomes generalized, if we, it then becomes pervasive in all areas of our life. The other thing is that people's responses to our anxieties are often reinforced, and this happens from the time that we are very, very, very young. Now, so we're going to take a really sharp detour. So we just talked about anxiety disorders, and now we're going to jump into the realm of the controversial and talk about dissociative disorders. Now, why the textbook has decided to make this leap, I don't know. But hey, we're leaping together. Now, so we're now shifting completely out of anxiety disorders, and we're going to talk about dissociative disorders. Now, people who become overwhelmed by stress can also experience an altered state of consciousness and become detached from reality. And this is the group of disorders known as dissociative disorders. And these disorders involve disruptions or breakdowns of memory, awareness, and identity. So the theory is that this dissociation is used as a defense against the initial trauma. Now, we talk a little bit, or the textbook talks about a state of what we call dissociative amnesia. And that's a psychological disorder that involves extensive but selective memory loss, for which there is no physiological explanation. This amnesia is normally brought on by a trauma, and people who experience this dissociative amnesia tend to forget things about their personal lives and may even fail to recognize family and friends. So this is a very selective amnesia, but also at the same time it seems to have some pretty far-reaching effects. Now, this amnesia is not attributable to substance use, to neurological issues such as seizures or traumatic brain injury, or any other medical condition. So that is the dissociative amnesia. We also have another type of dissociation, which is called a dissociative fugue. And this is a subtype of dissociative disorder in which an individual loses complete memory of his or her identity, and they may even go on and assume a new one. So an individual with a dissociative fugue experiences all the symptoms of dissociative amnesia, but also leaves the situation entirely. Now, this fugue state may range anywhere from hours, so like you could be missing work due to wandering, all the way to months, so moving away and assuming a new identity, and with the person being completely unaware that they're doing so. They're in the stage, and that's just how they are in the state, and that's just how they kind of respond. Now, dissociative identity disorder, or DID, has been highly sensationalized and popularized through press and pop culture. But it is important for you to note that this particular disorder is something that is also highly, highly controversial, all right? And really, at its core, what people are saying is that there is two or more distinct and individual personalities, each with its own name, memories, and personality traits that exists within the same person. Used to be known as multiple personality disorder. Now, people with this disorder experience extreme memory disruption. So, for example, Robert Oxnam, he claimed that he had up to 11 competing personalities that lived inside him. So if you want to read about him in his book, A Fractured Mind, you can kind of look up his claims there. Now, most people diagnosed with DID experienced significant physical and or sexual trauma. This leads to what some view as kind of a splitting of personalities. So one personality, the core, which handles everyday life, and one or more personalities, which are the alter or the alters, that deal with bad situations. And what ends up is that a person will switch from one personality to another. This occurs very suddenly, and it's often triggered by a stressful situation. Women are more frequently diagnosed with this disorder and tend to have more personalities if they do have this disorder. Now, you might say, okay, so what's controversial about this, John? We've heard about this a lot. Well, there is really a handful of psychiatrists who have diagnosed the majority of all DID cases in existence. So prior to 1980, there were only a handful of cases. All right, and by a handful, I mean like a handful. By the mid-1990s, there had been over 10,000 cases of DID that were reported. So some critics have suggested that diagnostic overshadowing by clinicians have led to the use of suggestion to bring about these personalities. So in other words, what they're saying is that, it's not so much that these personalities exist, but some clinicians who begin to query and say, oh, well, do you ever feel like you have another personality inside you? And all of a sudden the person's like, huh, yeah, like, I mean, maybe. And then they're like, oh, yeah, like, no, you totally do. Right? So that's diagnostic overshadowing, is everywhere that we look that we only see this one problem. So for example, if I'm, an OCD specialist, that everywhere I turn and everyone I meet, all of a sudden everything I see is OCD, right? That's diagnostic overshadowing. And critics, I think, have rightfully suggested that with DID, that's something that has happened. Now, some of these psychiatrists engage in very controversial interviewing techniques. So these, interviews last for 6 or more hours of continuous interviewing that cause these personalities to come out. Like, I mean, I don't know. If you interviewed me for 6 hours, I'd probably have a different personality coming out too. So, some of these kind of factors make us kind of scratch our heads and say, like, well, what do we do with this? There are some other reasons too, and you can review them there. This lecture really is too short to cover it all. Now, so how do we explain dissociative disorders? Well, compared to anxiety disorders, the causes of dissociative disorders are less clear. There's little evidence of a genetic predisposition. They seem to be almost entirely environmentally determined via severe emotional childhood trauma. That being said, we also know that the suffering is real for people diagnosed with DID. Over 70% of them have attempted suicide at least once. So we are not by no means saying that, so maybe we don't know exactly what it is or what causes it or even how we should best understand it. But we do know that for people who do get this label, that many of them experience a lot of suffering. All right, I'm going to pause here and we'll pick up on mood disorders in a bit.